Previously on Faking Michael. We heard that when the Casio tracks were released in late 2010, Michael Jackson fan sites erupted in outrage, with thousands of fans rejecting the tracks as fakes.
My reaction was instant, as was many fans. That's not Michael Jackson. And if they think they can fool us, then they must be insane.
And we heard that some of those fans believed that a deputy sheriff who goes by the name Jason Malachi was the actual vocalist on the tracks.
And Sony was going ahead with this, and this was fraud, and they didn't even care.
We also heard that when certain fans spoke out against the Casio tracks, the powers that be at Sony and the estate tried to silence them.
And I remember being really scared because we're dealing with officials in Michael Jackson's posthumous life, right?
And we heard that two fans in particular were raided, arrested, and criminally prosecuted by the British authorities after members of the Angelixon production team pressured Sony to take action against them.
They barged in the back door of my house. An officer said, "We're arresting you on suspicion of conspiracy to defraud Sony Music." And all of this really does show and highlight how powerful Sony is. And it goes to highlight that they were willing to do anything just to shut people up that were saying that these songs are fake.
Despite the extraordinary lengths that the estate and Sony went to in an effort to limit the backlash online, widespread protests regarding the Casio tracks continued to play out within the fan community in the aftermath of their release. In the early days, I remember thinking that if fans continued to speak out and continued to uncover evidence that the vocals were fake, that Sony and the estate might come to their senses and remove the 3 Casio tracks from the album. But as the days became weeks and the weeks turned into months, it seemed as though we were fighting a losing battle. As we've heard repeatedly throughout this series, there are 12 Casio tracks in total, the 3 which were released on the Michael album in late 2010, plus 9 additional tracks which remained unreleased. And while the protests of fans had failed to force Sony and the estate to remove the 3 Casio tracks from the Michael album, it eventually became clear that those protests had achieved something when fans got word that the estate had abandoned plans to release the 9 additional tracks on future projects.
I said, "Well, you've got 9 more songs. Are you planning to release them?" And he said, "We will never release any more Casio tracks. We'll never release any more Casio tracks.
That's the voice of a British fan named Simon Clark recounting a face-to-face conversation he had with estate co-executor John Branca regarding the Casio tracks. The conversation took place on the 2nd of September 2012, when Branca was mingling with fans at a Michael Jackson documentary premiere in London. The following is Simon's recollection of that conversation, recorded merely hours after the conversation took place.
Branca started shaking the hands of fans, and as he leant down to shake my hand, I said, "Can I just ask you a favour on behalf of all the Michael Jackson fans?" And he said, "Yeah." I said, "Can you never, ever, ever release any more Casio tracks?" And he said, "There will be no more Casio tracks." And I said, "Oh, are you sure about that?" And he said, "Yeah." And I said, "Well, you've got 9 more songs. Are you planning to release them?" And he said, "They will never ever be released. We only want to do what the fans want. We only want to do what the fans want to do what the fans want." And then he said, "Now I believe they're Michael." So I said, "Well, look, it's something we're going to have to agree to disagree on, but I personally believe wholeheartedly that it's Jason." I didn't say Jason Malachi, I just said Jason. Then he said, "Yeah, the impersonator." He called Jason the impersonator, and he knew exactly who I was talking about. And he said, "Well, I called him." And I said, "Yeah, I know you did," which kind of surprised him.
We heard about Branca's call to Jason back in episode 5, when discussing how Branca, along with estate attorney Howard Weitzman and Sony executive John Delp, all reached out to Jason in October 2010, 2 months before the release of the Michael album.
He said, "Yeah, I called him and spoke to him about this, And he's a police officer, by the way, and he would never do this because of his job. He would never put himself in that position. And I said, look, you cannot release any more of these songs. We can't have a repeat of this because it's caused so much trouble. And he says, we know the trouble it's caused and we're sorry for it, and we will never release any more of those songs. And I said to him again, do I have your word on that? He said yes, and he shook my hand on it. And it was obvious that he was well aware of the shit they'd caused. And I also got the impression that they wish they'd never fucking heard the word Casio, same as us.
If the estate really did wish that they'd never heard the word Casio, and if they thought by simply not releasing the 9 additional tracks that they'd never have to hear the word Casio again, they were about to be in for a rude awakening. While those 9 additional Casio tracks were never officially released, they did eventually leak online in the spring of 2013, which reignited conversations about their authenticity among fans on several Michael Jackson discussion forums, including a fan named Vera Sarova. Following their release as part of the Michael album, Vera had given the Casio tracks the benefit of the doubt, and had chosen to purchase the album based on the assurances made by both Sony and the estate, such as the description on the album cover, as well as Howard Weitzman's official statement. Vera was also influenced by Eddie Cassio's appearance on the Oprah Winfrey Show, where Eddie defended the authenticity of his tracks without having to explain any of the issues that had been identified with the vocals.
Eddie, there have been some questions, people saying that this isn't Michael's voice. What can you tell us about that?
I can tell you that it is Michael's voice. He recorded right there in my basement, and that's Michael Jackson.
But after hearing the 9 additional tracks when they leaked online, Vera came to realise that all the same issues within the 3 tracks on the Michael album were also present within those 9 additional tracks. And because of this, Vera's confidence in the official narrative began to fade, and she started to feel like the estate and Sony had indeed misled her. In the years following the release of the Michael album, many fans believed that the only way to truly get to the bottom of the Casio fiasco would be for one of the fans to file a lawsuit against Sony, the estate, Eddie Cascio and James Port, because this would force them to face the music under oath in a court of law. And so Vera decided that she was going to be that fan, teaming up with me to collect all the evidence that was available while researching which law firms might be interested in taking the case. The evidence that Vera had at her disposal included the testimony of several members of the Jackson family who had publicly stated that the vocals on the Casio tracks were fake, the testimony of producer Corey Rooney, who said that he and several other producers who worked with Michael during his life did not believe the vocals were his, the lack of Michael's trademark hand claps, finger snaps, foot stomps and headphone bleed in the Casio track vocal recordings, the fact that the songs did not appear in any of Michael's handwritten notes, the testimony of Tony Curtis, Jason Malachi's former producer, who said that he knew without a doubt that Jason, not Michael, was singing on the Casio tracks, and the fact that the copyright registrations for the Casio tracks, which were filed by Eddie Cascio and James Port in the aftermath of Michael's death, do not contain Michael's vocals. It should be noted that while Vera was unable to give an interview for this podcast, she and I did investigate the Casio tracks together for almost a decade. When I first met Vera in 2013, I'd already been researching the Casio tracks for 3 years and was planning to publish the findings of my research as a book. As we've heard throughout this series, when the Casio tracks were released in late 2010, both Sony and the estate claimed to have hired forensic audio experts to authenticate the vocals. And so in our very first conversation, I told Vera that I also wanted to hire an expert so that I could publish their findings in the book. But when Vera told me that she wanted to file a lawsuit, it made more sense that she would be the one to hire the expert. And so that's exactly what she did. engaging the services of a forensic audiologist named Dr. George Papson.
I'm George Papson, P-A-P-C-U-M.
As we heard in episode 11, when Vera first reached out to Dr. Papson, she didn't specify whether she believed the Casio tracks were authentic or not, just that she wanted Papson to conduct an objective forensic analysis and deliver a scientifically grounded conclusion. And as we heard in episode 11, after a 4-month study of the vocals, Papson concluded that the singer of the Casio tracks was not Michael Jackson, but that it was likely to be Jason Malachi. And so with Papson's forensic report in her hand, Vera spent the next 2 months trying to reason with the estate, hoping that if she presented all the evidence that she'd collected, they might come to their senses and do the right thing. On the 10th of April 2014, Vera put her case forward in a detailed letter to estate co-executor John Branca and attorney Howard Weitzman, attaching Papson's forensic report while asking them to officially remove the Casio tracks from the Michael album. Vera also asked the estate to reply to her letter by the 18th of April, or she would take the matter further. On the 17th of April 2014, one day before their deadline, estate attorney Howard Weitzman responded to Vera by email, informing her that the estate would not be removing the Casio tracks from the Michael album. And so Vera joined forces with a Californian law firm who took matters into their own hands.
In breaking news today, a Californian Michael Jackson fan filed a class action lawsuit against the late pop star's estate, record company, and several former associates.
The plaintiff, a woman named Vera Sarova, alleges that Michael Jackson's longtime friend Eddie Cascio and his collaborative partner James Port committed fraud by forging a collection of fake songs, 3 of which were released by Sony Music in 2010 on a posthumous album titled Michael.
The lawsuit also claims that Sony and the estate misled consumers throughout the Michael album's promotional campaign by falsely representing the Casio tracks as authentic Michael Jackson recordings.
Furthermore, plaintiff Sarova's filing reveals that she had the Casio tracks analysed by a leading forensic audiologist and that he concluded that the vocals did not belong to Michael Jackson.
Mrs. Sarova says that her goal in filing this lawsuit is to have the Casio tracks removed from Michael Jackson's discography, and for fans who purchased the tracks as part of the Michael album to be eligible for a refund.
The lawsuit was filed with the Los Angeles Superior Court on the 12th of June 2014, 3.5 years after the release of the Michael album. And what happened thereafter was true to form for everyone involved. Immediately after being sued for fraud, James Port made moves to cover his tracks by purging his personal Gmail account, meaning that every email that he'd ever sent or received from that account was permanently deleted, and that the account itself was completely shut down. Also purged was the Gmail account of James Port and Eddie Cassio's production company, which was also named in the lawsuit. But this wasn't the first time that Casio and Port had tried to cover their digital paper trail in connection to the Casio tracks. As we heard in episode 5, on the 19th of October 2010, when Casio and Port were asked to provide the outtakes from their purported recording sessions with the King of Pop, the pair claimed that they'd deleted them before destroying the hard drives and the computer that the vocals were recorded and edited on. 3 weeks later, on the 7th of November 2010, merely hours before the world premiere of Breaking News, James Port deleted his artist profiles on websites like Last.fm and MySpace, before going completely underground, avoiding all media, and seemingly wanting no recognition whatsoever for his so-called Michael Jackson song. Okay, now let's go back to 2014, in the immediate aftermath of Vera filing her lawsuit. On the 9th of August 2014, 3 weeks after being sued for fraud and purging his emails, James Port got married. His bride? Eddie Cassio's sister. By By all reports, the wedding was a thriller, with members of the bridal party putting on a Michael Jackson dance performance, with James Port up front as Michael, and several others, including his new brothers-in-law, Eddie and Frank Cascio, featuring as background dancers. Meanwhile, as Eddie Cascio and James Port danced the night away to Michael's music, the lawyers defending them against allegations of fraud began trying to settle the case, something which Vera was not interested in, unless that settlement involved removing the Casio tracks from the Michael album. In the end, settlement discussions dragged on for 18 months, but an agreement could not be reached. Vera simply wasn't budging on her demand to remove the Casio tracks, insisting that if her demand was not met, she would take the case to trial. And so on the 3rd of February 2016, the estate and Sony filed a motion with the court demanding to be removed from Vera's lawsuit, a move which would freeze the entire case against them for the next 6 years. The motion that the estate and Sony filed is called an anti-SLAPP motion, which can be filed by a defendant in an American lawsuit when they believe they've been unfairly sued to prevent them from exercising their First Amendment right to free speech. To explain how Sony and the estate were trying to use the anti-SLAPP motion to get out of Vera's lawsuit, let's hear from award-winning investigative reporter Charles Thompson, who I spoke to about this back in 2016.
So the term SLAPP stands for Strategic Lawsuit Against Public Participation, SLAPP. What's really strange about what the Michael Jackson estate and Sony are doing with Vera Serova is they are accusing her of filing a SLAPP case against them. So they've kind of reversed the typical roles in a SLAPP case, and they're saying that Vera Serova, the consumer, is filing a SLAPP case against them, the corporations. So she is saying, you have misled consumers about the authenticity of the songs on this album by saying on the album cover that all of the vocals on this album belong to Michael Jackson. They're saying, actually, that's just our opinion, and by filing this consumer fraud lawsuit, you are trying to prevent us from exercising our First Amendment right to an opinion. So they have filed an anti-SLAPP motion against Vera Serova. It's quite extraordinary what's going on in this case. They're basically saying, even if the Casio songs were fake, it doesn't matter because we didn't know that at the time, so we can't be held responsible for lying to consumers, but also we were merely expressing an opinion anyway, and this is not commercial speech, this is our opinion. This is our opinion. This is our opinion.
On the 7th of December 2016, 10 months after filing their anti-SLAPP motion, the estate and Sony made their arguments against Vera's lawsuit in court, which didn't go down well with the judge. In response to their claims that they didn't know the songs were fake, the judge said that it sounded to her like Sony and the estate were throwing their co-defendants under the bus by accusing Eddie Cascio and James Port of secretly making fake songs in their basement and then failing to disclose the truth when selling those songs to the estate. It should be noted that the concession made by Sony and the estate, that the songs were fake but that they didn't know, was not an outright admission. Rather, this concession was made hypothetically for the purposes of their legal arguments in court. But regardless of whether it was hypothetical or not, the judge wasn't buying it, also taking issue with their so-called free speech argument, accusing the estate and Sony of ripping people off by labeling the Casio tracks as authentic Michael Jackson recordings, if in fact they were not. In the end, the judge decided in Vera's favour, ruling that she was well within her rights to file a consumer fraud lawsuit against Sony and the estate. And in the aftermath of that ruling, Eddie Cascio's brother and James Port's brother-in-law, Frank Cascio, inserted himself into the conversation by trying to sell a CD containing the 12 Casio tracks, including the 9 unreleased tracks, for a minimum bid of $50,000. Okay, So we're going to take a brief detour from the subject of Vera's lawsuit to discuss Frank Cassio's attempted sale of the CD containing the Casio tracks, which Frank listed for auction as Michael Jackson's personally owned copy of his final album, consisting of 12 finished tracks, all with finished vocals. And so to discuss this, let's bring in my research partner, James Allais, to give his thoughts.
My jaw dropped. I couldn't believe it. Frank was putting up for auction a burned CD containing all 12 Casio songs. And it's amazing how all these connections and all the evidence lines up, because now we have a whole new attempted fraud by the Casios. Because there is absolutely no chance this CD was ever in the hands of Michael Jackson. It was mixed almost an entire year after he had passed.
When James says the CD was mixed almost an entire year after Michael passed, he's referring to the fact that Eddie Cascio and James Port hired engineer Stuart Brawley to co-produce the 12 tracks as part of the Angelicsson production team prior to selling them to the estate, and that according to Brawley, he didn't finish mixing the tracks until May of 2010. It was clear from Frank Cassio's description of the CD, outlined in the auction house's listing, that the 12 tracks on the CD were the exact same tracks that Brawley had mixed. The order in which the tracks were sequenced, 1 through 12, was identical to how they were sequenced when they were sold to the estate, and the length of each individual track was an exact match to the tracks the estate received. And just to reiterate, these tracks, with these mixes, in this sequence, did not exist until May of 2010, almost a year after Michael's death.
And therefore, it could not have been in Michael Jackson's possession in his lifetime at all. It didn't even exist.
The CD was being sold by a New York auction house called Gotta Have Rock and Roll, who included a photograph of the disc in their online listing for the item. On that disc was the handwritten word Bible, scribed in blue permanent marker. And based on our experience reviewing a decade's worth of James Port's copyright registrations, my research partner James and I were familiar with Port's handwriting. James recalls,
"We've seen enough of James Port's Copyright Office filings to recognize almost immediately that it was James Port's handwriting on that CD. Port wrote Bible on that CD."
Meaning that the CD of Stuart Brawley's mixes had been labelled by Port and given to Frank Cascio to auction. Needless to say, James and I wanted to know more about the CD. And so I contacted Gotta Have Rock and Roll and arranged for James to conduct an in-person inspection of the disc, something which the auction house was initially happy to accommodate. But things didn't go entirely to plan. James recalls,
"So pretty much immediately, we go into investigation mode, and because I was the one closest to the auction house in New York, Damien reached out to Gotta Have Rock and Roll to make arrangements for me to inspect the CD. And things were looking good. Damien was making the arrangements with the New York office, and didn't seem like anything we were asking for was unreasonable to the auction house or anything like that. But it appears the second they reached out to Frank Cascio about our request for an inspection, the listing was pulled entirely. He did not want the CD to face our scrutiny. And the auction house was saying the CD could fetch up to $1 million.
As I mentioned earlier, the minimum bid for the Bible CD was $50,000, but the auction house was telling the media that they expected a bidding war and that the CD could fetch more than $1 million. And so if someone is expected to pay $1 million for a CD, they should be allowed to inspect it and to scrutinise its authenticity, especially since the songs on the CD were at the time central to an explosive fraud lawsuit in which Frank Cascio's brother and brother-in-law were the defendants.
And I think it begs to ask, how did this auction even get this far? Seriously, did the auction house not do any work in their so-called certification of this listing? It's a ripoff and con on so many levels. For one, these songs, these exact mixes, leaked online years ago. They pop up on YouTube all the time, and to any savvy investor or collector, even if the vocals were real, These readily available tracks aren't worth $1 million, aren't even worth $50,000. People all over the world know them, and they know them as the fake Casio songs, the fraudulent Michael Jackson tracks. And I can't believe it. I can't believe the way the auction house missed all this. And they did so while there was an active consumer fraud lawsuit going on about these very songs. And I especially couldn't believe it was getting significant media coverage. It's as if they just took the ball from Frank Cascio and they just ran with it. And they don't really care that much about credibility. They don't do any due diligence. And the art world, or whatever you call this, is probably complicit in frauds like this all the time. The whole thing is a joke. The whole thing is a joke. The whole thing is a joke.
It should be noted that the auction house Gotta Have Rock and Roll had worked with Frank Cascio on several other auctions in the past, including the sale of Michael's personal medical items, like an empty pill bottle and x-rays of his broken foot, and another involving Michael's dirty underwear. In this auction, as well as the Bible CD featuring the 12 Casio tracks, Frank was again auctioning Michael's personal items, including more dirty underwear and a World's Best Daddy trophy, which was gifted to Michael by his children.
To me, these other more intimate items don't make a great impression about Frank's character. So why is he doing this? Well, here's what we do know. In February of 2017, this is about 3 years into the consumer fraud lawsuit, James Port and Eddie Cascio had racked up about $50,000 in legal fees, and they had demanded that Vera pay for it. In May, the court rejected Cascio and Port's request for the $50,000, and then 2 months later, the Frank auction comes up, a burned CD containing all 12 Casio songs. What's the minimum bid? $50,000. So there you go. One way or another, they're going to get their $50,000.
Okay, so now that we've circled back around to the subject of Vera's lawsuit, it's worth noting that when Eddie Cascio and James Port asked Vera to pay their legal fees, the billing records they submitted to the court revealed that to that point, it was the estate who'd been paying them.
Imagine that. These two guys, Eddie Cascio and James Port, have sold the estate a collection of fake songs. And when they get sued for fraud over those songs, the estate, who appear to be the victims of fraud at the hands of Cascio and Port, end up paying their legal bills. How does that even happen? That the victims of a fraud end up paying to legally defend the people who defrauded them in the first place?
And on the subject of the estate having been defrauded, any doubt that they had in fact been defrauded was completely put to rest behind the scenes in January of 2018. As we've heard throughout this series, when people first heard the Casio tracks back in 2010, many pointed the finger at Jason Malachi as the actual vocalist on the tracks. And in the years following their release, Jason himself has refused to confirm or deny being the Casio vocalist, telling people that he was unable to talk about it.
And he says to me, well, you know, I can't talk about it. I can't say I did it or I didn't do it. But who even says I can't confirm or deny? If you say I can't confirm or deny if I did that, you did it. You did it. You did it.
Not even Vera was able to get Jason to talk, trying unsuccessfully to reach him by phone after filing her lawsuit, and even sending him a letter with a copy of her forensic report, to which Jason did not reply. But on the 23rd of January 2018, things were about to change, when Vera's lawyer, Jeremy Bollinger, received a phone call from another lawyer named Alan Tills, who had been hired by Jason. Bollinger, who I spoke to in this 2018 recording, recalls.
You know, I had these conversations with his lawyer, who basically said, I'd like to meet with you to discuss with you how Jason might be able to help you guys resolve this.
And how was Jason going to help them resolve it? By finally confessing that he was the singer on the Casio tracks. This was the moment that the entire fiasco would come to an end, and the truth would finally be told. And so a meeting between Bollinger, Tills, and lawyers for the estate and Sony was arranged for the 30th of January 2018. But the day before the meeting was set to take place, Tills reached out to Bollinger to tell him that the meeting was off and that Jason's planned confession was not going to happen. When Bollinger asked Tills why the meeting had been cancelled, Tills simply said, "Ask Howard," referring to attorney Howard Weitzman, who was set to represent the estate and Sony in the meeting. Bollinger recalls,
"One conversation with Sony's attorney, and there was an immediate about-face from this attorney. Sorry, I can't meet with you." I mean, he was being kind of open and frank and friendly, and then it was like shut down. Wouldn't even talk to me anymore.
Part of the reason that the meeting was completely shut down was because, as well as confessing that he was the singer, Jason also wanted to be paid for his work on the songs, an idea which the estate did not like. And as if asking to be paid wasn't enough, Jason's lawyer also proposed the idea of releasing the 9 unreleased Casio tracks as Jason Malachi songs to clear up all the doubt about who was actually singing them. In the following recording, obtained just weeks before this final episode was released, Jason explains his lawyer's pitch to the estate.
Look, there's more songs that have been completed than just what's already been released publicly. So why don't we correct the situation, release them under the artist who it really is?
And according to Jason, this is the response he got.
Those songs will never see the light of day. And the minute you try to re-record them and release them, we will bury you. We will bury you. We will bury you.
In our 2018 recording, Vera's lawyer, Jeremy Bollinger, reflects on Jason's decision to remain silent and why he thinks Jason should come out with the truth.
He would have to be very strong to come out now and say, "I'm going to tell my story." You know, Sony has some very powerful lawyers. And, you know, I think Jason made whatever representations to them before. He may have said, "Hey, listen, I signed an agreement saying I won't ever talk about this." But if he has an agreement that says, "We acknowledge that you sang these songs and you're promising never to tell anybody," I mean, he should come out with that. You know, there's no way they'll recover. And, you know, if they want to go after him for breaching that contract, good luck.
Despite the fact that the meeting was cancelled, and despite the fact that Jason's lawyer had cut off all communication, he had disclosed Jason's confession as the singer of the Casio tracks. And so with that explosive new evidence in their back pocket, Vera's legal team filed a motion with the court, notifying all parties in the lawsuit that based on his confession, Jason would be added as an additional defendant at the next available juncture. But then, just when Vera thought that things were going her way, the courts dealt her a crushing blow. Allow me to explain. As we heard earlier in this episode, back in 2016, the estate and Sony requested to be removed from the lawsuit by arguing that they didn't know the Casio tracks were fake and that they were merely expressing an opinion when they said that they were real. We also heard that the presiding judge wasn't buying it, ruling that they would not be removed from the lawsuit and would have to face the music. But following that ruling, the estate and Sony appealed, asserting all the same arguments that they'd made the first time. Only this time, the appeals court judge agreed with the corporations, ruling in August of 2018 that the estate and Sony were legally entitled to sell fake songs under Michael Jackson's name. Californian attorney John A. Belcher, who runs an online video series titled Rock and Roll and the Law, gives his opinion on the Court of Appeals ruling.
We got a bizarre and frankly wrong decision by the California Court of Appeal that said there was a First Amendment right to describe the song as sung by Michael Jackson when in fact it was not, which certainly doesn't put much teeth in consumer protection statutes if in fact you have a First Amendment right to misrepresent the product that you're selling. And if in fact The allegations are true, and Sony and the estate of Michael Jackson made millions of dollars with a singer impersonator. Shame on both of them. That is a disgraceful attack on the integrity of Michael Jackson's music. It's a disgrace to people in the music industry to behave that way.
And so Vera filed a petition to have the Court of Appeal's decision reviewed by the Supreme Court of California, the highest court in the state, where less than 5% of petitions are successful. But Vera and her legal team felt that they had a compelling case, and were adamant that the Court of Appeal's decision to let the estate and Sony off the hook was wrong. In the end, the Supreme Court of California granted Vera's petition for review, which would ultimately take place almost 4 years later. And in those 4 years, Vera's lawsuit became a hot potato in the California court system. Despite the fact that it was waiting to be heard by the California Supreme Court, the case was sent back to the Court of Appeal, where their ruling on the culpability of the estate and Sony was set to be reconsidered. But when the Court of Appeals issued their new decision, it was exactly the same as their first one, reaffirming their position that the estate and Sony should indeed be allowed to sell fake songs under Michael Jackson's name. And so Vera petitioned the Supreme Court for a second time, where she was again successfully granted a review of her case. In December of 2020, while awaiting her day in court, Vera's case received a flurry of support from several consumer rights groups, as well as the LA City Attorney's Office and the Attorney General for the state of California. Investigative reporter Charles Thompson explains.
Now what's happened is all of these consumer rights groups have got involved in the case and said, we're standing with Vera Sarova because this can't be allowed to happen. And so the lead organization on the amicus brief is the UC Berkeley Center for Consumer Law and Economic Justice. But there's other groups involved like Truth in Advertising, the East Bay Community Law Center, etc. So this news came out the other day, and then just after that news broke, like a day later, it turned out that the Los Angeles City Attorney's Office is also planning to file an amicus brief. So what that means is that the government in Los Angeles will be joining the lawsuit with Vera Sarova to say the estate should not be allowed to say that Michael Jackson sang those songs when he didn't, which is enormous news.
Then, on the 24th of May, 2022, 8 years after her lawsuit was initially filed, the Supreme Court of California finally heard Vera's case, where 7 Supreme Court justices would consider arguments from both sides before deciding once and for all whether the estate and Sony should face the music or be removed from the case for good.
Good morning, all. And calling the first matter, Vera Sarova versus Sony Music Entertainment.
To start proceedings, Vera's attorney, Dennis F. Moss, asserted their position that when the estate and Sony labelled the vocals on the Casio tracks as having been performed by Michael Jackson, they were speaking commercially to their consumers, including Vera, about the content of their product, and that contrary to the ruling of the Court of Appeal, under California's consumer protection laws, if those statements are not true, they are not protected by the First Amendment.
And, you know, one of the implications of the Court of Appeal decision here is that art forgeries could take off all over the place, because if you could tell an audience that somebody painted a painting, wrote a book, or released an album, and it's not true, what the Court of Appeal decision does, it places an incredible burden on a consumer trying to vindicate their rights.
Vera's legal team also allocated a portion of their argument time to a lawyer named Samuel Harbort of the California Attorney General's Office, who was standing with Vera against the estate and Sony.
The Attorney General filed an amicus brief and sought argument time to address whether Sony's description of its product on the product label at the point of sale qualifies as commercial speech. The answer to that question is yes.
As part of his presentation, Harbort pointed out that if a seller finds itself facing substantial uncertainty about a claim it wants to make to consumers, the seller should simply be honest with consumers about that uncertainty by providing disclaimers or warnings on the product and its marketing material.
For example, here, all Sony needed to do to avoid false advertising liability was, rather than stating on the back of the album that it contained 9 original songs performed by Jackson, was to say, this album contains 6 original songs performed by Michael Jackson and 3 songs believed to have been performed by Jackson or that may have been performed by Jackson.
But when it came time for the estate and Sony to argue their position, they denied having any uncertainty about the authenticity of the 3 tracks in question.
I'm not saying that we're not certain. We don't hold the belief that there's a question about whether or not this is Michael. That's not the belief we held.
That's the voice of Zia Modaba, the attorney representing the estate and Sony in their defense.
I want to start by saying what I think is obvious. This is not a case about a bag of potato chips or a hammer. We're talking about distribution of core First Amendment protected artistic expression by a public figure. The Michael album receives every bit of First Amendment protection given to a book, a movie, or a political speech. And there are scores of cases that reflect this.
Modaba's assertion that the Michael album itself receives First Amendment protection caught the attention of one of the justices, who wondered whether Modaba believed that there was a distinction between the degree of First Amendment protection afforded to the singer of songs on an album and the entity who is trying to sell that album.
So if we were talking about Michael Jackson singing a song, I think we would agree that that falls within the First Amendment. What about the speech that is involved here on the part of Sony, which is their own speech about their own product?
The answer is the identity of the artist is part and parcel of the art, and it imparts meaning to the art. There's a song that Michael wrote called Leave Me Alone, and it's about being persecuted by the press. Now, when Michael Jackson sings that song, because it's Michael singing it, it gives a certain meaning to that song. If I sang that song, nobody cares about me, and it doesn't have the same meaning as if Michael Jackson sings that song. And that's why authors and the source of the art is part of and intimately connected to the art itself.
In other words, the estate and Sony needed to attribute the vocals on the Casio tracks to Michael Jackson, because if they were attributed to someone else, say for example the actual vocalist, nobody would have cared and the tracks would have been meaningless in the eyes of consumers. But Modaba wasn't done, adding that consumers of art want to know who the artist is, and that he cannot think of a scenario in which the identity of the artist doesn't matter.
Imagine art out in the world with no attribution of authorship. Imagine that you just didn't know who it came from or where the source was. It's not the same. There is a character and a quality and the impact and a curiosity even by those who consume the art. Where did this come from? What's the source of this? It adds meaning to it. We want to know who it is. We want to know where it came from. We want to know what inspired it. And part of that is the identity of the artist. And so I can't think of a situation where the identity of the artist doesn't matter.
And so if the identity of an artist is so important to the consumers of art, shouldn't the seller of the art, in this case Sony, be required to identify the actual artist, in this case the vocalist of the Casio tracks, rather than falsely attributing those vocals to Michael Jackson? Modaba continues.
The context here is you have the brewing controversy out in the public in general. You have Howard Weitzman's statement saying that we believe with 100% certainty, we believe that this is Michael Jackson's vocals. And not only did we put our thumb on the scale when we said these are Michael Jackson's vocals, I believe we actually jumped on the scale. People are out there trying to decide, is this Michael or is this not Michael? And we picked a side. We said it's Michael.
Okay, so there was a public debate over the authenticity of the vocals, and the estate and Sony picked the side that said it was Michael. But is simply picking a side enough in a situation like this? And what if they picked the wrong side? One of the justices wondered.
Your client is making presumably a lot of money based on this claim, right? So I'm just kind of wondering, who's in the best position here to know the attribution or to find out? What do the cases say about fraudulent attribution? Who bears the burden?
Sure. Well, none of the parties here were in any position to know, right? The Cassios were, and the Cassios were sued for fraud because they weren't in a position to know.
I just want to clarify, I've been listening carefully and taking notes here, and you talked about Sony making statements. I wrote down, we believe with 100% certainty that this is Michael. We jumped on the scale in terms of the division amongst the debate. I see from the record that shortly before the release, Sony publicly expressed, quote, complete confidence that these tracks were performed by Michael. But now I hear you to say, well, we really weren't in the best position to know with any certainty whether Michael was the singer or not. It wasn't readily verifiable, but we shouldn't be held accountable. How can it be both? Why is Sony saying with 100% certainty that Michael is the singer if you weren't certain, which is essentially what I hear you to be saying now?
The hearing concluded with Vera's attorney, Dennis Moss, reasserting his client's position that the estate and Sony were engaged in commercial speech when they told the world that the Casio tracks were sung by Michael Jackson. That based on consumer protection laws, a consumer who believes they've been defrauded should be entitled to file a lawsuit, and that in this particular case, the estate and Sony should be forced to face the music.
Thank you, Mr. Moss and Mr. Harbort and Mr. Madaber. Matters taken under submission.
With the Supreme Court hearing wrapped, it was now up to the 7 justices to make their decision about whether the estate and Sony remain defendants in the case or were allowed to walk free. But then, in the first week of July 2022, just 5 weeks after the Supreme Court hearing, and while Vera, the estate and Sony were still waiting for the court's decision, the 3 songs at the centre of the lawsuit, Breaking News, Keep Your Head Up and Monster, were removed from streaming platforms around the world.
Hello and welcome to the MJ Cast. I'm your host, Jamin Bull. After 12 years of struggle, the Casio tracks have been removed from streaming platforms around the world. There's been a long, hard battle in the public domain and the courts thanks to fan Vera Sarova. Obviously, what we're seeing at the moment is the result of that battle. Sony Music and the estate have decided to remove those fake songs, hopefully once and for all.
In a joint statement following the removal of the tracks, the estate and Sony revealed that as well as removing the songs, they had settled their lawsuit with Vera, saying that regardless of how the Supreme Court may rule, the parties of the lawsuit mutually decided to end litigation. In the end, the Supreme Court of California did issue a decision, ruling that false attribution of artistic authorship is never acceptable, while rejecting both of the arguments made by Sony and the estate, that they didn't know that the songs were fake, and that they were merely expressing an opinion when they said that they were real. This was a total victory for Vera. When I spoke to former FBI art crime investigator Robert Whitman about the settlement of the lawsuit and the removal of the Casio tracks, he said that other than having Eddie Casio and James Port arrested by authorities and prosecuted for fraud, forcing Sony to remove the songs was the ultimate accomplishment, comparing what Vera was able to achieve with the victory of David over Goliath.
Well, I think the ultimate accomplishment in this case is the fact that the complainant was able to have Sony Corporation take 3 songs off the album and remove them digitally from anywhere that could be downloaded. It's almost like a David versus Goliath situation where David has won again. And it just goes to show that, if someone's diligent and they do their homework and they come in with justice on their side, that they can win.
But while the Casio tracks were removed from online retailers, they weren't recalled entirely, with many stores around the world continuing to sell the 10-track edition of the Michael album, including the 3 fake songs. Even the official store at the estate's Cirque du Soleil production in Las Vegas still sells the fraudulent 10-track version of the Michael album, which Whitman tells me leaves the door open for further legal action regarding the Casio tracks.
There is a statute of limitations for almost all crimes in the United States except murder. Murder is not, there's no statute of limitations that runs on that. But most fraud crimes, most crimes involving stolen property or stolen pieces of artifacts or anything like that, it's about a 5-year statute of limitations. But in a case like this, because the fraud is ongoing, in other words, people are still buying the music, the fraud really falls within the 5 years of that statute of limitations. So it's an ongoing crime, which means the statute of limitations keeps re-upping. You see, in other words, it doesn't go away. The crime doesn't go away because it's ongoing. The statute of limitations would start from the day that the material is no longer available anywhere, and basically from the day that the last person downloaded or bought that fraudulent material.
Reflecting on the whole fiasco, the producer of this podcast series, Dan Villalobos, offers the following thoughts.
I really hope that this brings a lot of closure to the fan community and that we can begin to heal in some way. The damage that was done to the community was so deep and it lasted for such a long time. And I think it's ridiculous that it's been ignored. I think that the fans deserve an apology. I think that the Jackson family deserve an apology. And so despite the 3 Casio songs released on the Michael album having been commercially removed from streaming platforms and the CD, I would love to see Michael Jackson's name removed from Michael Jackson's BMI catalog so that Casio and Port stop continuing to profit from the recordings as Michael Jackson recordings, because the fraud is still ongoing. Copies of the 10-track CD, including those 3 Casio songs, Breaking News, Monster, and Keep Your Head Up, are still commercially available from some retailers. So the profits continue. I also think that the multiple acts of fraud and criminality in this case should still be investigated, and I think Sony and Michael Jackson's estate should be supporting this, and they should be leading the charge, because technically they were the primary victims. So why is this case so important to us, and so important in general? It was really important to tell the story because of how incredibly underreported and underinvestigated this story was from the very beginning. It shouldn't have gotten to this point. We should not be here right now making this podcast, collating all this information. It shouldn't have to take a civilian, take multiple flights around the world to investigate this, while major press publications didn't even bother to scratch the surface. It's the biggest scandal in the music industry ever. Secondly, and all power to Vera, what a hero and what an inspiration she has been throughout all of this. But it shouldn't have to take a fan filing a lawsuit to get the songs commercially removed, right? Had Sony and the estate listened to Michael's family, collaborators, and fans from the very beginning, we wouldn't be here. The whole thing is ridiculous. The whole story is ridiculous. So it's important to have a historical record of this. We have to remember that this fraud predates the mainstream emergence of artificial intelligence. Telling this story raises awareness of the dangers and the risks in the music industry, now more than ever. Think about it. Had this fraud taken place today, with the use of AI, the forgeries would be far more believable, far more realistic, to the point we may even struggle to perform forensic analysis with the same methodologies developed by Dr. Papson, for example. The consequences could be far more damaging, far more devastating than the Casio tracks. And if this can happen to the greatest, most recognizable music artist of the 20th century, it can just as easily happen to anybody else.
To wrap things up, here are the final thoughts and reflections from some of the people who found themselves connected to the Casio fiasco in one way or another. Michael Jackson's longtime photographer, Harrison Funk, who we heard from in episode 3, and who was in the studio for the majority of the Michael album's production, had this to say when thinking back on the project.
My impression was that Sony was intent on getting this record out. And I think that people make decisions based on what's best for their career and what's best for them personally. And they did what they had to do to get the record out. Beyond that, I think this is one of the most controversial music projects ever. And of course, when you're dealing with the king of pop, it's going to be at the top end of the spectrum, no matter what. And I think that's what we got.
Speaking in an interview with Vlad TV, producer Teddy Riley, who remixed several Casio tracks back in 2010, said that despite the lack of evidence in support of their authenticity, he felt pressured by the powers that be to say that he knew that the vocals were Michael's.
The whole situation with the Casios, I didn't know the real authenticity of those songs. They would not prove it to me. I was, influenced and pushed to say the things I would say about the songs. And I just felt I was dealing with some high, powerful people, and I didn't want no problems. But I just hope that the truth comes to light, because I was never proven to me. It was never proven to me that that was Michael's voice.
Reflecting on the whole situation, Teddy's manager at the time, LaWanda Lane, who we heard from throughout episodes 3, 4 and 5, takes aim at those in charge of Michael's posthumous legacy, in particular estate co-executor John Branca.
It was just awful. The truth is that it was all about money, and they had made so much money by putting out Michael's old music that they were greedy. Nobody gave a shit about Michael Jackson in any of this. Nor did they care about his kids, nor did they care about his siblings. They don't give a shit. I wish the world knew how they treat his mother. And if you ask me, John Branca should be removed because of what they did. Had they just been smart and kept songs that were really his, they never do anything smart because everybody is so cocky. And that's where everybody made their mistake and made the agreement that those songs are going to go on the album. And that's where everybody made their mistake.
Photographer Harrison Funk and Michael's nephew Tarrell Jackson discuss how Michael's fans stood up against the estate and Sony despite their efforts to gaslight and deceive them.
The fans are very astute, and the fans are not going to sit back and take any nonsense. You know, who's going to buy a posthumous album? It's either fans or people who have heard the songs and fallen in love with the songs. But you don't claim it to be somebody who it's not.
And that to me is the upsetting part, because now you're confusing true fans that deserve to enjoy his music, but it's not him. It's not him. So how do you do that? And how do you allow that? And at that point you feel, where does this end? How does it stop? And that's the scary part of it, because if people can lie and get away with it, then what? And that's basically what happened, and it continues to happen.
LaWanda Lane adds her thoughts.
And the only thing that's going to fight it is you talking, other people telling the truth, then the cracks will soon follow. And I never am this open, but now I am. Now I'm like, this is what it is, and why am I protecting people? And at this point, I don't care about doing an interview. I have nothing to hide anymore. And I will say this, the estate doesn't think that this is going to hurt them at all. And what they don't get, they've already done the damage. It's done, because you've already put it out there.
Michael's nephew, Taj Jackson, expresses his gratitude that this investigation was conducted and that this podcast was produced, adding that his uncle would have been furious to have known that his artistic legacy had been desecrated in the way it was with the Casio tracks.
I know my uncle would be super appreciative that someone like you did this, because, you know, to him, his art was everything. You know, it was his legacy. It was what he was leaving behind. It's like if someone took the David and did cheap knockoffs of it and said that Michelangelo did it, my uncle would have been furious, and said, how could they have done that to his art?
And last but not least, my co-researcher, James Allais, gives his thoughts.
James Port and Eddie Cascio, these guys are con men. Simple as that, through and through. And it just makes you wonder, what was the estate thinking? What was Sony thinking? Why would you make a deal with them in the first place? And then why would you continue to defend them? They con and they fraud on so many levels, and then they lie to cover up lies. Don't deal with them. Don't bargain with them. They cannot be trusted on any level. And I assume Sony and the estate realize that by now, but who knows? And together, Eddie and James, as demonstrated by the fraud, I know it's messed up to say it, but they truly demonstrate a creative acumen and inventiveness, and you could definitely say relentlessness. It's a shame those skills and those talents were applied in this way. It really is a shame. And I can't imagine it was worth it for them. As for Jason, I feel like he got the worst end of the deal somehow. I can't imagine it was worth it for him either. I bet this is a big weight on his shoulders. And, I hope we did a good job telling the story, and I hope the truth sets everyone free.
Faking Michael is a production of Oath Media, which is researched, written and narrated by me, Damian Shields. Original score, sound design and mixing by Dan Villalobos. Additional research by James Allais and Jamin Bull, and the teams at the MJ Cast and A Truth Untold. Artwork by Stephen Ward. If you enjoy the Faking Michael podcast, please consider rating, reviewing, and sharing it. Faking Michael is an independent piece of investigative reporting. All source material is used in a limited and transformative way for the purposes of commentary, criticism, demonstration, and education in accordance with fair use guidelines. Some of that material has been edited for clarity and time. If you'd like to contact the makers of this podcast, support our cause, or order a copy of the Faking Michael book, please visit our website at fakingmichael.com.